In the spirit of Mahmoud's talk, maybe we should call the Indian Ocean the Afro-Indo-Asian Ocean? Afro-Indo-Asian? Does that work, Ross? Afro-Indo-Asian? No hyphens, no dashes. The Australians will get upset? Yeah. The Afro-Asian Sea. Afrasia. Okay, that's good. But your lecture pointed out beautifully where I wanted to start my talk, so thank you. And I wanted to start my talk by saying that it doesn't lessen the achievements of Ibn Battuta as a great traveler. We all know what stamina, what courage, what vision he had. But in traveling this Indian Ocean, I'll just call it that, he was traveling well-trodden paths, as you just pointed out to us. There was nothing really new about a traveler going back and forth across the Indian Ocean. And everywhere he went, as was pointed out by the keynote speaker, everywhere he went, he met institutions, travelers, Sufi orders that were familiar to him. He was traveling a very familiar world in the Indian Ocean. I'm not going to speak much about Ibn Battuta. I'm going to talk about an earlier traveler, a much earlier traveler, named Tajuddin Abdurrahman al-Hindi al-Malabari, better known as Cheraman Perumal here in Kerala. He's a mythical figure, you might say, a legendary figure. The famous king of Kerala who converted to Islam, supposedly. We don't know for sure. History, legend, and myth get all tangled up in this story. And so instead of calling it history on the one hand, and pretending like we can document it, which we can't, or calling it legend on the other hand, which tends to dismiss it, I'll just call it a narrative. It's a story. And by calling it a narrative, we also point out that it's a written narrative, but one whose origins are in oral storytelling. So this narrative has elements of oral storytelling, even though it comes down to us as a written document in Arabic. And it's a little bit embarrassing for me to be standing here talking about this because we have such eminent scholars from Kerala who've written about this figure and this history so much more than I have. So it's very humbling and also honoring to have been invited to speak to you today. I also am representing not just myself, but my colleague who's standing here. She's invisible. Her name is Roxani Margheriti. She couldn't come to be with us, but she teaches with me in Atlanta at Emory University. She and I worked on this document together. We translated it into English and wrote an article about it, which is published in the Journal of the Economic and Social, JESHO, Economic and Social History of the Orient, last year. So thanks to Roxani Margheriti, who is not here. This story is really important because many sources on Malabar's history in Arabic, starting with Zainuddin Makhtum, in Persian with Farishta's history, and then later with Barbosa and others in Portuguese, all talk about this account. But in fact, as a textual document, there's not much, and it's not very old. What Roxani Margheriti and I found is that there's an Arabic document. There are 2 existing copies of it now. I can hold it up and show you what it looks like. I don't have slides to show you. Both of the copies of this document are in the British Library now in London. So we got our hands on both of these documents and translated them. Now, Tajuddin Abdurrahman al-Hindi is otherwise known in Arabic as Shakarwati Farmad, which is an Arabized pronunciation of Cheraman Perumal. And Johannan Friedman, the great scholar in Israel, was the first in English to look at these documents, and he wrote a summary of them and a discussion, but we went based on his work and tried to present a translation. And we call this an account of the origin of Islam in Kerala. And it's actually a narrative of the origin of Islam. And of course, there are competing origin stories based on the idea of a king who converts to a new religion and leaves Kerala. The Islamic version of it is just one version. There's a Christian version, there's a Shaivite version as well. Now, we know, of course, that Arab Muslims arrived very early in Kerala, earlier than anywhere else in India. That's no surprise because of the trade routes. But the question of how these early travelers who became settlers generated an indigenous Islamic community here, the Mapala community, is one that is difficult to answer. This text, this narrative, the story of Cheraman Perumal gives an answer to that question. And so we can think of it as a foundation story. It's a story that talks about the foundation of a community. And in fact, the narrative ends with the foundation of a series of 10 mosques up and down the coast of Kerala. The story has in it some historical elements, that is the foundation of mosques in cities that we can identify, talking about the foundation of waqf grants, that is land grants to uphold those mosques and pay the salary of a qadi, the appointment of port authorities, the Shahibandar, in various cities. That's where it ends, but it starts in a more mythic zone that has to do with visions, miracles, and rather more fantastic events. So those are elements of an oral tradition of storytelling that are also found in the story. There's a real mix of historical fact and mythical storytelling. So I can talk some, although it's probably not so interesting, about the actual manuscripts and how we ended up with them. We know that the oldest manuscript, it's an Arabic text, was written in Malabar. That's what the British collectors recorded about it. It was probably taken from Malabar by Tipu Sultan to Mysore, and was taken from Mysore by the East India Company when they conquered Mysore, and it ended up in Fort William in Calcutta. There, a master of Arabic, Sheikh al-Arabiya, made a copy of it. He was an employee of the East India Company, and a second copy of the text was then in circulation. The narrative, many of you may be familiar with it or other versions of it, those of you who grew up here in North Kerala. The narrative is in 3 parts. There are actually 3 separate stories told together. The first part is about the Prophet Muhammad and the splitting of the moon miracle, right? Where he performs a miracle. There's a bleak reference to it in the Quran when it says Shaqqat al-Qamar. And that part of the story is told about the Prophet splitting the moon in half and causing it to go to different sides of the mountain near Mecca. And supposedly, according to this story, it also went through his sleeves of his gown and out the other side and back together. Now, an event of that cosmic scale, it caused some of the Quraysh who were opposing the Prophet to convert. But you can imagine that the splitting of the moon should have been seen in other places. And so the story says there was somebody else who saw it, and that was a king in Kerala, Cheraman Perumal. And so then the story shifts to India, and it's about this king who witnesses the event, and nobody can explain it until some wandering Sufis come through town. They're on their way to Adam's Peak in Sri Lanka to make the pilgrimage that was referred to earlier today. And the king asks them about the splitting of the moon because none of his local astrologers or scientists could explain it. And that wandering Sufi, who this text calls Zahiruddin Madani, we don't know who he is. Sheikh Zahiruddin Madani explains the splitting of the moon and said, oh, the Prophet Muhammad split the moon on a certain day. That's what you saw. And so the king supposedly converts to Islam, but secretly. The third part of the text has to do with Arab Muslims, especially Malik ibn Dinar and his relatives, who then, through the agency of this king who converts to Islam, come back to Kerala and establish mosques. So those are the three stories. They're very distinct, but they're told as a continuous narrative in this text. I'll read you a little bit, just excerpts. The text is much too long to read to all of you. But it begins, and it's an anonymous text. We don't know who wrote it or composed it. And that's because it comes out of an oral tradition of storytelling. It simply begins, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Qissat Shakarwati Farmad, radiyallahu anhu. That's the title, the story of Shakarwati Paramal. It's been narrated by Muhammad, the son of Malik, from his father Malik, from his grandfather Habib ibn Malik, may God be content with them all. And it happened in the time when God revealed a verse from the Quran saying, so preach to your family and your closest relatives. That's when the Prophet Muhammad began to preach publicly and to generate a lot of opposition. This in the story leads to a plot by some of the leaders of the Quraysh to discredit Muhammad by insisting that he perform a miracle that's impossible. But he performs the miracle. Then, on that very night, the text says, God displayed this miracle of the splitting of the moon to the ruler in India, and it calls him Sultan al-Hind, by divine power. The ruler was amazed at the sight and recorded its date in his annals. His mind was very disturbed by thinking of how such a remarkable event could have happened. He summoned his priests, in Arabic, kahin, the kahinin, and his astrologers, the munajjimin. They came to his assembly, and he asked them about this miraculous event. He gave them a period of 40 days to investigate it. But after the 40 days had passed, all the astronomers and the priests failed to explain it. They said, we don't know anything about it, and we don't find anything in our books of knowledge. Now, later, the perplexed king sees in a dream the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And the Prophet said to him, you've seen my miracle as the moon split in two. The ruler said in his dream, yes. And the Prophet then informed him of the whole story of how the splitting of the moon happened. When the ruler woke up, the text says, he immediately felt in his heart an intense love for the Prophet and a zealous desire to join the Prophet's religion. So he was so smitten with love of the Prophet, he no longer ate or drank or took delight in bed. That's not very good for a king. According to the story then, in this state of secretly wanting to become a Muslim but not being able to do so because of his position as the king here in Kerala, he began to question all the travelers that came through town. It mentions Jewish and also Christian and also pagan Arab travelers that come and stop in Kerala to trade, and all of them the king invites to court and he asks them about this miracle. None of them can answer successfully, although some of the Jews and the Arabs who come say, oh, yeah, it's said that there's a troublemaker in Arabia who's trying to discredit real religion by talking about these things. So the secret Muslim king in Kerala knows that, okay, I can't ask these people too much more about it, and he's patient and he waits. The text says, finally, after many years, a large group of Sufis, Darawish is the Arabic term, the plural of Darwish, a large group of Sufis arrived, and their leader was Sheikh Zahiruddin Madani from Medina. The group was trying to make the pilgrimage to the footprint of Adam in Sri Lanka. The ruler hosted them with hospitality. Then he requested a private audience with Sheikh Zahiruddin and asked him about the splitting of the moon. The sheikh told him the whole story from beginning to end. The ruler then asked him about the date of this event. When the sheikh told him the date, it was the same one that the king himself had recorded in his journal. So the Indian king was overjoyed by this confirmation of the event, and Sheikh Zahiruddin was amazed at the ruler's inner sincerity and willingness to give up his kingdom That's what the text says. So there's an equation here of conversion to Islam with an understanding that that means the king will have to give up his position as king. In giving up the position, the text says, he thought deeply about all the people of his realm. He assigned to each one lands and villages. He wrote to each one a separate letter describing the boundaries and lands assigned to each, dividing up the whole length of his realm of 140 parsangs, as measured in Malabar, so that none could trespass beyond his allotted boundaries. Then the ruler took with him precious jewels and large pearls and much gold and silver and coins, and he boarded a ship. He boarded the ship with the sheikh and the Sufis, and he went to Arabia. When he gets there, he meets the Prophet Muhammad, according to the story. And the Prophet says, when some of the companions of the Prophet, and in this text it's Abu Bakr Siddiq, who says to the Prophet, how is it that you're greeting this guy who's just showed up as a stranger so intimately? And the Prophet says, indeed, he's a great king from the land that provides black pepper and ginger, which is called the land of India at Malabar. The Indian ruler was amazed that the Prophet could tell his story having not been present. The Prophet knew everything that had happened to him. Then the Prophet said to him, what's your name? And he said, I am called Shakarwati Farmad, which is Chakravarti Perumal. At that moment, the Prophet gave him a new name and called him Tajuddin al-Hindi al-Marabari. Now, that's the second part of the story. The third part of the story begins then with the king living with the Prophet and his companions and having an especially close relationship with Habib ibn Malik and his brother Malik ibn Dinar. Okay? And the Habib ibn Malik and Malik ibn Dinar decide that they're going to take their whole family and all of their friends and return to India with the king. They want to do that, but when they get ready to go, they get to the port in Sheher, and the Indian king gets ill. He realizes that he's deathly ill, and he's not going to make the trip back. And so he told them, this is Malik ibn Dinar and his wider family, you should all not delay in your journey to India after I've passed away. Then he wrote a letter to them in the language of India. What language was that? It doesn't say. Would he have been writing a letter in Sanskrit? Certainly not Malayalam. Well, not if that was the 8th century, I don't think so. So he wrote a letter in the language of India, and he wrote down the names of the rulers in India, meaning those people appointed to all of these locations up and down the Kerala coast. Their realms, their capitals, their treasuries, their relatives, their armies, and all the rest that they would need to know of the rules and the customs of India. He specified that they must disembark at the port of Kudungallur, right, which is Kraganur in the British terminology, which was the center of his rule. He then said, do not mention to anyone how ill I am. For if it's known that I have died, it means the death for all the people of India. It's just as our prophet has said, the believer is alive in both worlds. Indeed, he simply moves from one world to the next. So this, again, is a very deep legend in Kerala about a king who disappears but isn't dead and who will come back at a certain point to establish justice and a reign of peace. This is the Onam legend, right? The idea of the great king Mahabali who gets pushed down into the underworld but will come back again. It's a very, very ancient myth here in Kerala. This story of a king who converts, becomes Muslim, goes off to the Holy Land, and then doesn't come back but keeps it a secret, is just a retelling of that myth in an Islamic clothing. Now, lots of adventures happen, but eventually Habib ibn Malik and Malik ibn Dinar and their whole family, and the text is very interesting in that it specifies the names of the women that they are married to and some of their daughters, and the idea of great men and their nephews is established in this text, which of course is similar to that matriarchal system that one finds in parts of of Kerala. That seems to get reproduced in an Arabic text in surprising ways. The family comes back, bringing with them 3 stones from Mecca, and they establish several mosques. The biggest of these mosques were established each with a stone that was brought in from Mecca. The first one was at Kugle. And interestingly, they said that this family came over with 2 ships. One ship landed in Malabar at Kugle and started this process of building mosques up and down the coast. The other ship, according to this text, went to Malabar, which is the Coromandel coast on the Tamil side, and landed at a place called Takipatnam. If anybody here knows where Takipatnam is, I would love to know. I haven't been able to trace out any town on the Tamil coast that used to be named Takipatnam, named after somebody named Taqiyuddin. Kayalpatnam? No, it's called Takipatnam, like the name Taqiyuddin. Tengapatnam? And that's on the Coromandel coast, on the Tamil side? So maybe that's it. Thank you. That's great. So 2 ships land. The story doesn't say anything really about the second ship that lands in Malabar, but it gives great detail about the activities of this extended family that lands in Malabar. They established 10 mosques. 3 of them are established on stones brought from Mecca. And finally, Malik ibn Dinar and some of his relatives, they go on a trip back to Arabia and then up to Khorasan, where he dies. And at that point, they pray together. They pray to God for their children, saying, "O Lord of the worlds, O compassionate with the brokenhearted, make our children and their descendants to be jurists and scholars and pious leaders, ascetics and judges until the day of judgment." Then the text ends rather abruptly, just talking about the establishment of these 10 mosques and naming who among this family settled there as the qadi of each mosque. So this is the story. I went into it in some great detail because it's an interesting story. There are comparisons to be made but with other foundation stories of different communities around the Indian Ocean. Let's just call it that for convenience. One of those foundation stories is the one that you brought up in the Maldives, which was recorded by Ibn Battuta of Abul Barakat. Again, a foundation story of how conversion happened, how a community was founded. There are other stories from East Africa which mirror this similar idea. A king who gets abducted or who disappears, becomes Muslim, and then comes back to his people spreading the religion. So I'll conclude by there are many points to follow on this text. There are many things in it which prove, some people in the room may not like to hear this, but who prove that it could not have been written in the lifetime of the Prophet or immediately after. For instance, it says that the Prophet gathered his family at a place called Dar al-Khayzuran. Dar al-Khayzuran is a place well known in Mecca, but the name of it was given by an Abbasid ruler, Khayzuran. She was a queen, actually, who founded this place. It wasn't named Dar al-Khayzuran until much later in Islamic history. For instance, using the idea of Sufis, using the word darvish to talk about sailors or travelers in the time of the Prophet, that term didn't exist as a technical term. There are many such instances that show that this text was composed orally or textually in a much later period. That doesn't mean that it's not true, it just means that it was formulated and written down at a later period. But there are other more positive aspects to it for local people here, and I'm going to get to the end. The legend argues for the unique and privileged position of the Mapala Muslim community in interesting ways. Kerala Muslims emerge as the fruit of early conversion by the region's great king, and not as the byproduct of Arab warriors or settlers or conquerors. Conversion was caused by an indigenous tradition of rational inquiry, scientific observation of the heavenly bodies, rather than the result of cultural inferiority or backward superstition. In other words, the local person who becomes the agent of conversion is a very positive person. The local culture is not put down in this narrative, even though Arabs coming from abroad are important agents in the process. This legendary king counts as one of the earliest converts in the generation of the Prophet Muhammad, giving the local converts, who maybe came many generations later, a sense of equal participation in the early Islamic community. And there's a certain irony here. In the text, powerful Arab merchants and princes, who were very noble in their own place, rejected the Prophet Muhammad and dismissed him as a sorcerer and a rival. But an Indian king from a community that's described as kuffar in the text, infidels, meaning a Hindu community, he saw the signs and interpreted them correctly with only the tools of his own personality and his own native culture. And so he was able to accept the Prophet through indigenous wisdom, even as some of the Arab princes close to the Prophet, sharing his culture, rejected him. So there's a very interesting, ironic turning on its head of the great respected status that Arab merchants and traders and settlers had in this area. Finally, I think it's a bit speculative to say when this story, this local story, was turned into a text. It probably happened during the influence of the Rasulid dynasty in Yemen on this Konkan and Malabar coast, which is sometime in the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries. And it certainly was a widespread story, and it existed in a textual form by the time Makhdum Zainuddin was writing his famous Tuhfat al-Mujahideen, the earliest Arabic language history of Kerala. Malayalam language histories of Kerala also repeat this story, like the Keralopati and others. So this is just a small window through one text. There may be other Arabic versions of the same story in a different textual tradition. I'm not sure. So that's just one small contribution to this history of the astounding Muslim community that formed here in Malabar, which Ibn Battuta found when he arrived in Calicut.